In this video, I'll be testing 5 of the newest severe snow tyres and benchmarking them against a studded tyre and a milder winter tyre. These 5 tyres are designed to be the ultimate winter tyres on snow and ice because these are intended for the regions that see a lot of snow and ice. But how do they compare to a studded tyre and a tyre that's a bit more rounded, a Central European winter tyre? Well, we're going to find out. Because these are all severe winter tyres, I'm going to be digging in specifically to the winter qualities, focusing heavily on snow performance and ice performance. But I will of course be testing the wet and dry performance of the tyres, the noise to comfort and the rolling resistance to give you the biggest picture possible to find out which tyre is best for your own driving needs. It's going to be a really exciting test, so let's get on with the testing. The snow performance of these winter tyres is critically important, and yes, I realise that the snow performance of any winter tyre is pretty important, but these are the types of winter tyres you fit in an extreme winter region where you're driving on snow and ice. So these tyres sacrifice dry and wet performance to give you the very best snow and ice performance possible. Are any of them bad? Well, actually no, they all have an acceptable level of grip, ranging from acceptable to absolutely excellent. The Marshal was the slowest around the lap. Now, this is the cheapest tyre, but it still had good snow grip. You wouldn't not buy this because of the outright grip, although subjectively it was quite peaky to drive, and that means as you lost grip or around the limit, once you'd stepped over, you'd drop off the level of grip quite quickly, which meant it was just difficult to understand, and you'd sometimes turn in and it would just keep on going straight and you'd be waiting on the front, but good traction and braking. Next up was the Michelin and Nokian. Now the Michelin had very, very good grip. You could really feel the grip in traction and braking. However, turning again, a bit like the Marshal, it was just a bit peaky. So as you got to the limit of grip and as it dropped off, as you got past the grip, whether it was the front axle or rear axle, just took longer to recover. The Nokian was just a really lovely all-round tyre. Excellent grip, very good drivability, although it didn't feel quite as strong overall as the Michelin on traction and braking. It was just an easy tyre to drive, so that counts for something. And finally, almost tying, you had the Continental and the Goodyear. Now the Continental, without a doubt, had the very strongest front end of all the tyres. There was almost no point during this quite windy handling lap. I was turning in with the Continental and thinking, oh, is it going to turn? It turned every single time, and it turned hard and strong, which I really liked. In fact, it turned so strong, it actually brought the rear into play a little bit more. So there's a sequence of corners you sort of bounce through left and right. With the Continental, you felt like you were racing around them, and no other tyre did that. The Goodyear, it was just a really easy, lovely tyre to drive. Quite a different character from the Continental, but very similar grips. They were both excellent. They both had their own characteristics, and I enjoyed them both for different reasons. Highly recommended. In fact, I know I said all the tyres are good. The Marshal is good, and the other 4 are absolutely excellent in the snow handling, so no downgrade for them. What about the studded tyres? Well, you might be thinking, studded tyres on wintry conditions, this is a match made in heaven, and you know what? Mid-pack, and don't forget, this is one of the best studded tyres on the market. Why? Well, studded tyres, they need to keep their studs pointed in the direction and in the tyres. They don't want them being pulled out. So they often have either a slightly firmer construction or a slightly harder compound to achieve that, and that means in snow, where you're not using the advantage on something hard below, the studs actually have a slight disadvantage often, and that's what we found today. And what about the Central European winter tyre, the Continental WinterContact TS 870? Well, this is a tyre that has less emphasis on outright snow and ice grip because it's used more in climates that have more like cold and wet running over the winter. So it should have much better dry and wet performance than the other tyres, but be down in snow and ice. However, it vastly overperformed for where I thought it was going to. It was quick around the lap than the Marshal and around the same as the studded tyre. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops on ice, which sadly, as ice is really hard, we'll be moving to shortly. Continental led the way in snow traction, with Goodyear taking the top spot in snow braking. This time the studded tyre performed better, being significantly ahead in snow traction, while the mild winter tyre finished as expected. Ice handling. Now let me give you a quick lesson in why I moan about ice quite a lot and why it's difficult. Last night I did ice testing on this very lake, running about a 55-second lap. Now it's had a little bit of snow on, we've brushed it with a big mechanical brusher, and I'm now running about 65-70-second lap, so a huge difference. And ice stability is incredibly difficult. If the ice changes temperature too much, That's it, you've changed your amount of grip. If the sun comes out and puts some heat onto the surface, some energy into the ice, you've changed the grip. If the ice gets too smooth, you've changed the grip. Smooth ice is the most difficult ice to get grip on, and I'm telling you this for a reason, keep that in mind. As for the winter tyres around this ice handling track, well, it was actually fairly similar to snow, where a good tyre in snow is a good tyre in ice and vice versa. The Marshal was the slowest around the lap. It had okay grip, it was perhaps marginally passable, but like in snow, it was pretty peaky in terms of grip and it dropped off very quickly if you went offline or if you overstepped the limit. So it was a very difficult tyre to drive around the lap. The Michelin X-Ice Snow had really good grip, but like the Marshal, you were on a bit of a tightrope, as when you lost grip, it just fell off very quickly and didn't have a lot of reserve to pull the car back in line and give you that confidence to slide around and enjoy the experience. And the final three tyres, the Nokian, Continental and Goodyear, they were all fabulous. Excellent grip, excellent drivability, loads of reserves, and you really felt, you didn't feel like you were driving on ice. They gave you more confidence, more subjective confidence than the time would indicate. And for that, I think that it's well worth investing in the correct tyre for ice. Speaking of the correct tyre for ice, what about the incorrect tyre for ice? The Continental WinterContact TS 870, the Central European winter tyre, not really designed for heavy ice use. Well, once again, it vastly outperformed where it should be, getting around faster than the Marshal, which is incredible. And the studs, you think, finally, studs, this is the ice. This is where the studs dig in. It should absolutely own the group. Mid-pack. Insane, right? It happens. The softer compound of the Nordic winter tyres flexes more, keys in more with the rough surface of the ice, and on rough ice, the studs can offer no advantage, and in this case, a slight disadvantage over the very best. What you did have with the studs was confidence. When the car was at the edge or sliding, the studs gave you so much controllability compared to the Nordic tyres. There was a big difference there. So that is where a studded tyre has an advantage even on rough ice. Speaking of advantages, I like to do lots of different kinds of data points to give you as much information as possible. So I made sure we did traction and braking at least once on smooth ice. And this is where the studs excelled over 30% better than the best Nordic winter tyre, and the Central European winter tyre was over 60% worse. This really shows where studs matter and a really ice-focused compound matters on smooth ice, because smooth ice is pretty much all compound. It also shows how the Marshal falls off a little bit. I did also do traction and braking on rough ice, and the results are completely different. So I'm not going to talk about them. I'm going to put them on the website, linked in the description, so go check that out. And let's move on with the test. Wet handling is certainly a very important quality of a winter tyre, but this particular category of winter tyre have to work best in snow and ice. And as it is currently impossible to produce a tyre that works amazingly well on ice and really well in the wet, you can tell that this category of tyre has had its wet performance coming at second place during development. Now, there is quite a spread of times, and usually, as you know, I test blind, so I like to guess what I'm driving on as I'm going through the set numbers, and normally I can do a pretty good job, but in this test, I've been completely blindsided. It's not what I expected. In last place and slowest round a lap was the Michelin X-Ice Snow. Now, it was a safe understeer primary balanced tyre. It wasn't bad to drive, it just lacked grip. And in fact, I was so surprised by this, I have gone back now and looked through other tests of it recently, and it seems the Michelin really has just fallen behind in the wet a little bit. Now, the Michelin was one of the best in ice, so as you can see, this is perhaps the performance trade-off they've chosen. Next up was the Marshal. Now, this tyre moved the balance of this Golf a little bit towards oversteer, which isn't what you want on the road. You don't want a wandery back end, but the grip was actually pretty good, so I'm going to give it a break. And the steering loaded up nicely. It wasn't a disaster, so fair play to the Marshal there. Next up, in what is quite a big gap to third, we have the Goodyear. Now, every time I drive a Goodyear tyre, I'm always pleased with it. It always handles nicely, especially when I'm using a Golf as a test platform. And once again, Goodyear have delivered. It was just simply an easy, lovely, predictable tyre to drive. Had good grip, it was very stable in the corner, and the steering was nice. So good job to Goodyear. Second place goes to the new Continental. Now, if I remember correctly, the Continental was also excellent in ice. The Continental with this new tyre have done a very good job of blending wet performance and ice. So congratulations to Continental. The balance of the car, well, I wouldn't call it a sports tyre, but none of these tyres are sporty. It was quite light on the steering and had a little bit of understeer, but that's exactly what you want. And finally, essentially in a category of its own, was the Nokian Hakkapeliitta R5. Now, historically, the R5 hasn't been the best in the wet, and it seems Nokian have updated the compound to improve that, and improve it they have. Maybe a little bit too much, because it was just so far ahead of everything else around the wet lap. I'm very impressed. In fact, I always do the reference tyre at the end, so in this case it's the Central European Winter tyre, the Continental WinterContact TS 870, and halfway around the lap I was like, have they accidentally bolted on the WinterContact? But no, they hadn't, because then I went and did the WinterContact, and that was, what's the best way of describing it? If you've ever changed from like a normal winter tyre or an all-season tyre to a summer tyre, you'll notice how much the car tightens up, the steering becomes more responsive, everything happens more directly, and it was exactly like that with the WinterContact. Of course, I have done wet braking as well. As we know, wet braking is very important, and as you know, things lining up make me very happy, and the order between wet braking and wet handling was identical. But the Nokian did flex itself a little bit more. I think it was nearly 20% ahead of the second place tyre, so that's what I mean when I say Nokian might have just gone a little bit too far towards wet and maybe reduced the ice performance a little bit too much. But anyway, let's go look at the deep water resistance of the tyres. The Goodyear was the best in both straight and curved aquaplaning tests, with the Continental on average the worst in deep water. But the real winner was again the Central European Winter tyre, which had a much higher capacity to clear standing water. While in some regions these tyres will barely see dry tarmac, I of course still tested the dry qualities of the tyres. In dry braking, the Nokian stopped the car the best, but it was just 0.3 metres ahead of the Continental, which were both a couple of metres ahead of the Marshal. Goodyear was fourth, and surprisingly Michelin was last, which is unusual for the French tyre. Unsurprisingly, the milder winter tyre was the best overall, but not by as much as I expected this time. The dry handling testing comprised of the usual mix of steering testing, lane changes to assess stability and safety, and of course I did a lap time because that's the fun part, although honestly not so fun on these tyres. The Nokian was once again the best. This time the Goodyear was second and the Continental in third. But as always, the gaps were really small. Honestly, all of the tyres felt a little sloppy during the high-speed lane changes and the handling lap, but that is part of being an extreme winter tyre. Shockingly, the comfort testing was again incredibly close, but the Goodyear and Nokian did have the best comfort levels by a tiny margin. The Continental had the lowest external noise levels. Finally, the Continental had the lowest rolling resistance. Nokian and Goodyear also performed well. The Michelin had what I would call a moderate rolling resistance, and the Marshal was at the level you'd probably start to notice at the fuel pump. So on to the final results. As I don't do these tests that often, I spent some time playing with the score weighting, trying to balance the dry, wet, snow and ice performance the best I could, though in the end it didn't really affect the overall positioning. Remember, you can use the link in the description to visit the Tyre Reviews website and put in your own score weighting preferences to see which tyre works best for your own driving needs. In last place was the Marshal iZen KW31. The fact that this tyre was outperformed by the Central European Winter tyre in the snow just sums it up, but the tyre underperformed in every category. Given this tyre is designed for extreme winter climates, but it was nowhere near the group in the snow and ice, it might be one to avoid. The Michelin X-Ice Snow finishing fourth by a small margin was not on my bingo card at the start of this test, but the data is the data. It was strong overall in ice and not too far off the top three in snow, but when you factor in a high rolling resistance and the weakest dry and wet performance overall, fourth is as good as it gets for the French tyre. It is now one of the older extreme winter tyres. Hopefully there will be an update soon. The Nokian Hakkapeliitta R5 would finish second in a score weighting more towards dry and wet, as it was simply in a league of its own in those conditions. Sadly, this dry and wet performance has slightly compromised its winter abilities. It was good in snow braking and snow handling, but it did struggle a little bit in snow traction. But the real issue was its smooth ice performance in the traction and braking tests. They were way off the group. Good comfort and a good rolling resistance round out a reasonable result for the R5, but I would like to see some of that wet grip traded back for ice performance. As always, Goodyear has developed a solid all-round tyre. Its only real weakness was wet braking, where it's 14% off the best. However, it was solid in the dry, good in wet handling, it had the best aquaplaning resistance, which could be important in wet winters. It was the best overall in the snow and the second best overall in ice. Add that to the joint best comfort scores and a reasonable rolling resistance, and the Goodyear UltraGrip Ice 3 is a very impressive tyre. Finally, we have the new Continental VikingContact 8, displaying an impressively consistent result. It was one of the best in the dry, very good in the wet if you ignore an unusually low curved aquaplaning result, the best overall in snow, and the best overall on ice, the quietest, and it had the lowest rolling resistance. That is a mega combination of abilities for the new Continental, which make it a deserved winner overall. Let me know your thoughts below. Any questions, please ask, and as always, safe motoring.